It began among gays in America. Young men started falling sick, and nothing the doctors prescribed could stop them dying.
They had not been exposed to anything, any disease process or chemical that anyone felt was dangerous, and yet they were dead, in their 20s and dead.
By the mid-80s, scientists knew it was serious. A virus in the blood called HIV, usually passed on during sex.
I've worked in really severe worldwide epidemics for 20 years. I have never seen an agent as dangerous as HIV.
There seemed no limit to the numbers who would die.
The numbers are numbing, staggering. Not in modern history have we seen such a sweeping plague.
Now, in the late 90s, AIDS is out of the headlines. Have we learnt to live with it? Has it gone away? Or have we just got bored with the predictions of doom? Nearly 20 years on, no one is sure exactly where AIDS began. But this is one of the cities where it first flourished, San Francisco. It soon emerged that the new infection was spreading through the bathhouses. Dr. Selma Dritz was the doctor who sent people in to investigate.
They brought back reports that would have curled my hair if I hadn't already curled it. They weren't using the baths for bathing, believe me. There was a lot of sexual interaction. A nude man would be lying face down on a bed or a platform with an open can of Crisco next to him, and that was it. And he took on all comers, and anything could be transmitted, and it was.
Today, sex is back in business, but in a different form. When the bathhouses were closed down in 1984, sex didn't stop. It just went underground, which the health authorities reckoned was even more dangerous. So they began encouraging sex clubs, which promoted safe sex. One of them, called Eros, is owned by Buzz Benz, who's HIV positive himself.
Due to the regulations from the San Francisco Department of Health, we can't have little rooms or little cubicles that have doors that close on them. That's a traditional bathhouse. We can't have those anymore. So what we have are semi-private areas where people can cruise each other, where they can flirt, and then they can find a little space to go together with each other. One of the things I like about this room is that you can kind of appear and disappear, and you can look through slats and see what someone's doing and peek out and turn the corner. Safe sex supplies are everywhere in these rooms. We have a dispenser here for water-based lubricant. We have condoms. We have latex gloves. There's paper towels, so that literally you are within arm's reach of safe sex supplies everywhere in the playrooms. We tell a customer what their rules are before they come in. They agree to the rules, and they are told that these rules will be enforced. And if we see unprotected anal intercourse going on in this facility, the customers are asked to leave. No question about it.
But San Francisco's approach is not typical. Other cities where the plague once flourished have taken a strong line against open sex.
In New York, we currently have Mayor Giuliani completely closing all the sex venues in the city of New York. It's just being stomped out. The city of Los Angeles attempted to do exactly the same thing. Generally, the attitude of Department of Health has been either I'm going to ignore this situation because I can't deal with it, or we're going to close them down.
The assessment gays themselves make of the risk has changed. A survey found that even in San Francisco, unprotected sex was on the increase.
It is clear that one of the last things that gay men want to do in a sexual interaction is, first of all, reveal their HIV status. The second thing they want to do is that they don't want to do is to talk about the mechanics of how the sex is going to be. You know, you want it to be magic.
All over the world, the safe sex message has been wearing thin. London was never hit as badly as San Francisco, and in this gay club, wearing condoms is no longer a priority.
No, they should do, but they don't. No, they don't practice safe sex.
Quite often I'm in sort of clubs where sex happens on the premises or in cruising areas, and the number of people that sort of want to have unsafe sex is becoming quite shocking, really.
I became positive at 21. I've been on the scene for 2 months.
I think whether you're in a club or whether you're in a bed, kind of, there is that moment where it's, can I be bothered? I really should, but this is amazing.
It was always the older guys that were getting AIDS, but the younger guys thought that because it's the older guys, if they stuck to their own age group, that they would be affected.
In 1986, the AIDS prevention campaign had been spearheaded by Dr. Michael Adler. Now he's worried.
There's no doubt that HIV/AIDS has gone off A, the political agenda, and B, the public's agenda, and also added to that the gay men's agenda. It is true that you're getting younger gay men who were not part of the gay scene at the start of the AIDS epidemic, who are saying, well, you know, people like Professor Adler are trying to spoil my fun.
The Terence Higgins Trust has recently commissioned a new commercial aimed at reminding gay men that even people in stable relationships can get HIV.
In this particular work we were developing, it was that fact that a high percentage of HIV occurs in relationships was actually the one nugget that kind of like really struck us as being unusual. And we felt that was a wider message that needed to be told, and the best way to do it was on television.
It's obviously sensual, but I don't think it's explicit in any way, and I think if somebody's going to be offended by that, then I think they're going to be offended by homosexuality anyway. I think gay men are so used to seeing HIV prevention work in the gay press, on all the normal gay media, that to have it on a mainstream media, actually, like, it'll stop them dead in their tracks and go, oh my Lord.
I hate the idea of one of us.
Marcus Conant looked after the very first AIDS cases in San Francisco in 1980.
Young gay men today are not as careful as young gay men a decade ago. But it's not that they're slipping back. They're just becoming who the others were. The others became, the men a decade ago became so frightened watching their friends die literally on the sofa in the living room that they changed their behavior. But they didn't change it because it was a better place to be. They changed it because they were terrified. Now, with young people hearing that AIDS may not be a fatal disease if there's a treatment, they're not terrified.
That is the key. The safe sex habit is changing because the sense of doom that surrounded AIDS in the early days has gone.
We shall not give up the fight, we have only started, we have only...
In the 80s, a diagnosis of HIV infection was like a sentence of death. There appeared to be no way of treating it.
What was remarkable was that when you got this disease, it looked like everybody died, and we never had a disease like that.
At one point, it was estimated that people were dying of AIDS around the world at a rate of 1 every 12 minutes. The demand for treatment grew intense. Sufferers formed an organization called ACT UP.
Act up, fight back, fight AIDS! Act up, fight back, fight AIDS!
What's happening now is that patients are desperate. They will take anything. They'll pop anything into their mouth now. This is the first case, I think, in history where the actual afflicted people are taking control, taking charge of the epidemic.
This is a story of a coalition. My interpretation...
After 10 years and $1 billion spent on research, rumors started circulating that a drug had been developed which appeared to help people at an advanced stage of AIDS. It was called AZT. Pressure from ACT UP meant safety rules were relaxed to allow all HIV sufferers speedy access to the drug, but it was a false dawn. In London, Nick Maxwell's experience was typical. In 1994, he was put on an experimental course of AZT. It simply made him worse.
Whilst I was on that trial, my various symptoms were going up. I was getting chest infections every other week, skin problems, all sorts of bits and pieces.
Nick felt so ill he came off the trial. A detailed analysis in Britain and France later showed that AZT on its own was virtually useless. It was typical of the disappointments that dogged the search for an effective treatment. Some combinations of drugs seemed to work for a while, but in the end, most patients relapsed and died. The big breakthrough was made in Philadelphia, at the laboratories of the pharmaceutical giant, Merck. The man behind it was a brilliant young scientist called Irving Siegel. He knew from other studies that an enzyme known as protease helped the virus to reproduce itself inside the cell. He reasoned that if the action of protease could be blocked, the virus could be stopped in its tracks.
Those of us who were here at the time developed an almost immediate respect for Irving. He was an incredibly brilliant, but even more so, very driven individual.
In December 1988, Siegel was in London explaining his theory to British researchers. After his lecture, he was keen to get home early for Christmas, so he changed his flight and managed to get one of the last seats on Pan Am 103.
Last night, all 258 people on board a Pan Am jet en route to New York were killed.
Most of the dead were American, among them Irving Siegel.
It was the typical reaction of, disbelief and just wanting to sit down and not do anything for a while.
Siegel's death set back progress, but colleagues took up the challenge to make his theory work. It was frustrating without him. The protease inhibitors did block the virus in patients, but only temporarily.
There was always a feeling, obviously, that a lot had been lost that was not replaceable. But then, as you can imagine, what it also did is that it certainly galvanized the effort, and his spirit certainly lived on.
Irving Siegel's protease inhibitors were being tested at the Thomas Jefferson Hospital. The breakthrough came when they tried using the protease inhibitor in combination with other drugs, even AZT. To the team's excitement, one patient, number 142, seemed to stay well.
Even with the more sensitive assay, I had an initial decline in virus levels, just like all the other patients, but wasn't rebounding. In fact, it dropped below our ability to actually quantitate the virus, and it essentially disappeared. What it told us was that our goal was indeed possible to achieve, because if you can achieve it in one patient, there's no reason why you can't achieve it in every patient.
By 1996, Merck scientists were ready to announce that they had at last made real progress. They arrived at the annual International AIDS Conference in Vancouver, expecting a rapturous reception. Instead, they found angry members of ACT UP waiting for them.
It was pandemonium for a few minutes at the AIDS conference this evening when 6 to 10 members of ACT UP San Francisco came running at a panel of doctors, spraying them with strawberry
The protesters greeted papers about the new treatment with skepticism and contempt. They were still bitter over the way AZT had dashed their hopes.
This conference is nothing but drug company hype, and it needs to be stopped. Ban combination therapy, stop protease inhibitors, ban AZT now!
But gradually it began to sink in that this was no AZT. Midway through the conference, the mood palpably changed.
I can remember sitting in the large conference hall and hearing presentations and watching various people, either through their expressions or the questions they asked, begin to realize that the whole epidemic was changing, that we now had the opportunity to have some people live for the rest of their lives, perhaps, on some of these therapies. And it was really fascinating to watch because members of the press would get it, and certain scientists would get it, and certain doctors would get it. And those of us that had been working with the protease inhibitors knew that that was going to happen. But to watch everyone finally come up to speed at the same time, and by the end of the conference, of course, everyone had gotten it.
Patients from cities where the death toll from AIDS had been high still needed convincing. In New York, journalist Andrew Sullivan had become HIV positive in 1994. After Vancouver, he went to a meeting of the treatment action groups to hear doctors say that this time, things would be different.
The Treatment Action Group were a bunch of old act-uppers whom I'd known for a long time and who were extremely angry and very skeptical, and if you told them that, you know, the sky was blue, they'd want to know how you knew that and how many studies there had been to prove it. And so they were all there, and I showed up, and it was a big meeting, and David Ho, who was like one of the key scientists involved in this, showed up to brief them on the Vancouver report, and he went through the data. That within weeks, people with up to several 100,000 viral particles per milliliter of their blood had been reduced to 10. I remember one of the people asked, well, what's the highest number of viral particles that were reduced to undetectable? And he said, looked us straight in the eye and said, 6 million. And as he said that, I just remember looking around the room and seeing the chairs squeak, the people move in their chairs, because this is what we'd waited 15 years to hear. And when we heard it, it was like, this cannot be true. We can't believe this, because if we believe this, we're going to crash again. We're going to find out it's not true. But at the same time, the data was absolutely unmistakable. And I remember walking out of there and walking out to a friend of mine's apartment, and I said to him, he was working at the time at his computer, and he let me in, and I walked in, and I said, Robert, it's over. It's over.
For the first time since the onset of the plague, there now seemed to be the promise that HIV wasn't a death sentence. The impact of the drug cocktail was almost miraculous. In 1997, for the first time, the death rate from AIDS in America dropped by 50%. It was the largest single year's decline for any disease ever recorded. For Tony Whitehead, who founded the Terence Higgins AIDS Trust in London, the protease inhibitor literally saved his life.
I feel better than I ever imagined I would. To be perfectly honest, I thought I'd be dead by now anyway. Sometimes I am sad because the new treatments didn't just turn back the clock for me. A lot of damage had been done. I mean, I'm now partially sighted, and that won't repair itself. I have a few problems getting about, and but those moods of worrying about that pass in moments, and I'm just so glad, so grateful that I can enjoy a useful life, and I'm just looking forward to the future.
It used to be that in our local paper, the Bay Area Reporter, there would be 20 obituaries a week. Just 3 weeks ago, there was a big front page headline on the BAR, no obits. For the first time in, 10 or 12 years, there was not one single obituary in the BAR.
For Nick Maxwell, the impact was equally dramatic. Within weeks, the virus had disappeared. Instead of anticipating death, he could look forward to life.
Last year, I celebrated my 30th birthday. I had a surprise party. I told my family I wanted a surprise party, and they said, well, why? And I said, well, it'll be a surprise if I get to 30, won't it? But it was a surprise to me to reach 30. I didn't think that I was going to hit 30. That was a milestone for me. And I put that down to being on the combination therapies.
The new treatment had dramatically improved the life expectancy of anyone with HIV, but it was by no means the end of the story. For a start, there wasn't enough evidence to say for certain when the treatment should start. Understandably, patients wanted it as soon as HIV was diagnosed, but some doctors, like Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, sounded a caution. Back in 1993, he'd been one of the few doctors to resist the similar rush to prescribe AZT, feeling too little was known about it.
AZT was shown
to be beneficial in people with advanced disease, and it didn't take long before it was recommended for people with less advanced disease, and doctors aggressively prescribed AZT monotherapy for a good number of years, and then eventually it was up to the French and British trial to show that people who took that course of action actually were worse off. And so you'd think that with that experience we might actually pause a little bit and ask ourselves whether or not we might end up in the same position.
For anyone who did start the treatment, life became a grueling ritual of swallowing tablets. The combination therapy meant taking up to 30 pills a day, with no food for long stretches.
Monday's gone, halfway through Tuesday, and these are the tablets that I've got to take. My alarm goes off 7:30 in the morning. They have to be taken on an empty stomach. These have to be taken with food. And then I'm lucky enough I can have a 12-hour break. If I take those sort of between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock. And then between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock at night come these. Again, I have to take these with food as well.
And once on the medication, patients could never come off it.
If they stop their medication, even for a period of a few days, the virus comes back, and it comes back at a level higher often than where they started medication. In other words, there's a rebound.
What's more, the medicine caused some people to have a distressing redistribution of fat around their bodies, and nearly all of them had sickness and upset stomachs.
The diarrhea became impossible. I was spending hours, I was spending half an hour in the bog. You had numbness in your face. It was like permanent Novocaine. And it felt like you were sort of licking metal pots and pans.
The net effect was to make many patients deeply depressed.
I would lie on just here for several days at an end. Maybe I'd have the TV on, maybe I wouldn't. And one day I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm depressed. I've got depression because of this.
San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge is a magnet for the suicidally inclined. Those that are spotted in time are referred to Dr. Kate Behrer, director of the psychiatric emergency room of the San Francisco General Hospital.
Of the patients that we see in the psychiatric emergency room, anywhere from 10 to 20% of our patient population are either HIV positive or have, in fact, full-blown AIDS. Of those, 2/3 of them are coming in with depression or suicidal thoughts or drug problems that are directly related to their diagnosis.
Many of the unit's patients simply can't live with the combined therapy regime.
You're consigning someone to swallowing 30 pills in the morning, 10 in the afternoon, another 10 at night, changing their eating schedules so that, and food is a social event, and some of them can't even participate in kind of eating normally anymore. So I think though the triple therapy can turn people's lives around for certainly a period of time we've seen, it comes at a cost. It's not a straightforward gain.
But the biggest problem of all is the cost. For 90% of HIV sufferers worldwide, the new treatment is irrelevant. They simply don't have the cash to pay for it. Outside America, the epicenter of AIDS is sub-Saharan Africa. What are now thought to have been the very first cases surfaced in the 60s around Lake Victoria. By the early 80s, it had become an epidemic, with Uganda the worst hit. One day, Dr. Sam Okwari heard that people were dying of a strange disease called SLIM in a remote trading post by the lake. He took a 4-hour drive to an isolated community living on the shore. It had no law, no school, no doctor. The local trade was smuggling. When he went inside the houses, Okwari was shocked by what he saw.
We went into some of the houses to see what had actually happened and also to see the patients. The clinical symptoms were rather different from anything I had seen before. They were very much wasted. The patients were actually dry. In fact, I remember there was one particular boy whom I saw, and he had been completely drained to the bone because of chronic diarrhea which he had been having for a number of months. There was a lot of agony on his face, and really the situation was quite pathetic.
Nearly 20 years on, Josephine Sanyonga is a living victim of those early days. She's 73 years old. 7 of her children have died. They're buried nearby in makeshift graves covered with building tiles. No one has the time or strength to dig holes. 18 grandchildren were left in her care. She reached the point where she could no longer cope, no longer find the food to feed the children, and decided to lock herself and the grandchildren in the house to die.
So I just decided that I'm going to lock up myself in the house. I lock up my children in the house. We sleep and die. And when we die, many people will see that they have died because they didn't have food. So I came in and locked the house and slept.
Luckily, a neighbor found her in time.
Now when she saw me, she says, why are you sleeping at this hour? I told her that I'm very much tired of these children. I don't have even anything to feed them, to make them live. So she said, okay, you come, let's go.
The neighbor collected enough money for Josephine to continue to feed the children. But there's no one to look after them if anything happens to Josephine. What surprised researchers as the early statistics came in was that HIV was then even more widespread among the city middle classes than among the poor. Typical was Major Ruranga. By the time the disease was identified in Uganda, he was already infected.
And I was told I had AIDS. It was very hard. I just couldn't imagine having gone through the war. Many colleagues died in the war. I did not die. And here I was told, just black and white, you are going to die. People were so scared. And people told me, if you say anything, you are going to lose your job. After all, I think you even die very fast. But my mind kept saying, yes, to die. You will die, even if you keep quiet.
Overcoming his shame, the Major went on an AIDS offensive to warn his colleagues.
There was a lot of stigma, especially on condom use. In fact, I remember the first days in the AIDS Information Center where they used to call me Captain Condom. I was still a captain by that time. I was not a major. And I would blow condoms because they were saying there were perforations in the condoms and all this. I would blow condoms and show them, look, there is no air that passes through, tie them up. I would have them as balloons all around. Yeah. At one point I had about 3,000 soldiers all together standing. And I asked, if any of you is impotent, please put up your arm. Nobody was willing to put up the arm. And then I said, you know, this presupposes that all of you are candidates for HIV, since all of you do say you want to have sex. So how do we fight it? And all of them said condom. So there is indeed behavior change.
But the condom campaign in Uganda has been paying off. HIV among pregnant women has gone down steadily for 5 years. Moses Dombo from World Vision has worked in AIDS prevention since 1986 and has noticed tremendous changes.
If you went around the shops, you find in certain places people are busy buying and selling condoms. The fact that people can buy and sell condoms is indicative that people are involved in protective sex. Because of that high level of awareness, we shall not have the types of infection rates that we had in 1985, between 1985 and 1990.
Despite improvements, thousands are still dying without treatment. The tragedy is that many of these lives could be saved. The new combination therapy drugs are on the shelves, but only for the very few who can afford them. To give them to everybody with AIDS would cost more than Uganda's entire national budget. And drug companies are businesses, not charities.
We have got these which belong to reverse transcriptase inhibitors. These are protease inhibitors.
They say, look, we have been investing a lot of money, billions of dollars in developing these drugs. We must recoup our investment. And you turn around and say, haven't you done that? And then they say, yes, we have, but we're not satisfied yet, because we must also be able to invest for the next generation of drugs that are going to come through.
It is very painful. I know these drugs are there, and I know they can make a lot of change. I have been attending conferences. I have friends, you know, in Europe and America, and I know these drugs work. But I see my friends die. Even if you brought drugs, the triple therapy and whatever, with these drugs, the way they cost, because they're very, very expensive. You know, one needs about $1,500 per month. I mean, that is not affordable in Uganda. I don't earn a salary, and I don't think many people in Uganda earn that kind of a salary. So there is no way drugs will get rid of the disease.
Once there were houses all along this lane. Statistics in Africa can be erratic, but at least 1.75 million Ugandans have died of AIDS. What puzzled scientists was why in Africa it should have spread so fast and struck so hard, and not even in Africa as a whole, but only in certain parts of the continent. One reason was not scientific, but social.
The thing I think that you find in Africa and the developing world is very high levels of sexually transmitted diseases. And we now know that having a sexually transmitted disease increases your chance of being infected, but it also increases the chances of you transmitting HIV.
This broad conclusion was backed up by an extraordinary study carried out by an international team in next-door Tanzania. Doctors did just two things. They provided clean water and treated all genital infections promptly. The results were dramatic.
They reduced by 42% in a matter of about 2 to 3 years the incidence of HIV in their community. In very simple studies, sort of almost barefoot doctoring, they've been able to show that simple antibiotic treatment of genital infections and treating these infections early substantially reduces the incidence of the HIV infection.
In a separate study, Professor Oliver had seen the same relationship between hygiene and genital cancers. All across Islamic North Africa, where hygiene was built into the culture, both the cancers and HIV were rare. 3 other surveys then found that circumcision also helped prevent the spread of AIDS.
When they've studied the different populations and, more importantly, looked at circumcised and non-circumcised men using the same prostitutes, they found the reduced infection in the circumcised male.
But the problem went much deeper. The early investigations had shown how AIDS had spread along the truck routes between country and city. Changing that was like asking to change human nature.
You have situations in most African countries where you have rural poverty. Men not able to live on the land, moving away from their families into large cities, therefore separated from their families for long periods of time, and will therefore be sleeping with prostitutes. So you have a lot of urban prostitution, men separated from their families, then going back to their families. Women who usually are in African communities, very often disempowered, not able to negotiate safe sex, raise the issue, for example, of their husbands using condoms, so they begin to get infected.
Lavina Nalubega was a casualty of that lifestyle. She's now sick with AIDS, with a Kaposi sarcoma growth on her face. Her husband died of AIDS 2 years ago, leaving her with 5 children. She herself tested positive in December '97. She loved her husband, to whom she was married, she says proudly, for 13 years and 3 days.
When we were married, I was very faithful to my husband. The only way I suspect is that my husband used to drink, and when he gets drunk, he used to be a little immoral. So I suspect that maybe it came through my husband, because one time I even talked to him that why can't you stop drinking and you live faithfully, and he said, for me I only drink, there's nothing else that I do. So I said,
Her abiding worry is what will happen to her children when she dies.
when I look at the side where I'm born, my side, I don't see anyone who can come in and help my children. And when I look at the side of my late husband, I don't see even anyone who's able to look at my children. Maybe God knows who can come in to help him, help me, help my children. But currently, there's no one I can see.
At a glance, the elegance of St. Petersburg is a world away from Africa. By 1987, there were only 23 reported cases of HIV in the whole of Russia. The Russians didn't believe AIDS was their problem. AIDS was a disease of gay men in other countries. But they were living in a fool's paradise. American Tim Mead now looks after expatriate Americans with AIDS, as well as Russian cases.
You know, it was only until about 6 months ago that HIV in this country was being blamed on a few foreigners who were traveling through. And they were totally convinced that the only HIV cases in Russia were in the foreigners, that there were no Russian people who had HIV. And this is in spite of the fact that there were hundreds of Russians lying in hospitals dying of HIV who were undiagnosed or not properly diagnosed. And even after that came to light, the very first steps that the Duma took were to try and isolate the people from HIV by restricting foreigners with HIV from traveling in Russia. So you see, they weren't really recognizing the fact that the infection is here and the problem isn't amongst the Western people. The problem is right here and growing.
Gay men suffered acute discrimination. In the 80s, homosexuality was still outlawed in Russia, and Nikolai found himself first sacked from the police force, then prosecuted on 2 counts, for being gay and for being HIV positive. He was imprisoned for 4 years in solitary confinement.
It was a prison regime. I was in a single cell about the size of my kitchen, without a window. It was called the death cell, where they put people who had the death sentence for their last days before the execution was carried out. That was the kind of cell they put me in.
Russian youth observed better discipline under the communists. Drugs and rock and roll, if not sex, were Western-only pastimes. So it came as a shock when it emerged in the early 90s that the young of post-communist Russia had taken to drugs in a big way. In St. Petersburg's Pasteur Institute in 1997, Tatyana Smoliskaya was testing blood for HIV when she received some samples from a town on the Baltic called Kaliningrad and got results she couldn't believe. They were recording positive at an extraordinary rate, all from the young people in the town.
Some of them, yes, were really drug addicts, but some used drugs only 1 or 2 times during the dance, during party, and they practically don't know what does it mean AIDS.
Her records show that between 1996 and 98, infections in Kaliningrad went up from 28 to 1,850. It was the sharpest increase and the highest number of cases in proportion to population ever recorded.
Sasha, can you cough a few times?
The tragedy was that it all happened so quickly that none of the young drug users had ever even seen a sick AIDS patient. There was a reason for the sharp increase.
And this has been traced to a procedure that we here have been called pooling. That's where people are actually using their own serum to mix up certain narcotics, which are then shared with a large group of people. A very efficient way to transmit the virus to many, many people.
Drug taking is now common in the army. Vladimir Malevich enlisted at 18, took drugs at 19, and became HIV positive. A brain abscess has paralyzed the right side of his body, and he can't speak. Without treatment, he will not live long. As in Africa, doctors have little to offer but comfort.
So will his paralysis ever be cured?
I don't know. I don't know, but we try to give support.
The bars in his room have been installed because patients have tried to jump from the window. Dr. Izveni Voronin runs the main AIDS hospital just outside St. Petersburg. He has an impossible job. He used to have $20,000 a month to buy medicines, but in the current economic turmoil, it has been reduced to $2,000.
Because we have very difficult patients from all Russia with HIV, we have patients with AIDS, and sometimes we have spread on one patient's 2,000 during the 1 week.
Konstantin Kostaya is a third-year medical student who is seriously ill with AIDS. There is virtually no treatment available to him.
Карт в больнице нет практически вообще вот. Насчет третьей терапии я вообще не думаю, мне предложили ее за $1000 в месяц. При моей пенсии в $15 на сегодняшний день.
Это очень хороший.
А вообще вот отношение к будущему? Оптимистично, я оптимист.
Without insurance or private means, combination therapy is virtually impossible to obtain. Drug companies know demand is growing and sometimes supply needy patients free of charge. But in Tim Mead's view, that's not entirely altruistic.
Drug companies have learned some good lessons in terms of name and brand recognition. So it's important to get your medicine in the community. Sometimes it's important to get it in first.
Whoever pays, the big problem in the current Russian climate is ensuring the supply doesn't dry up.
The important thing with combination therapy is that it's all or nothing. You need to be on a proper combination that suppresses the virus. If you're on a partial combination that doesn't suppress the virus, resistance develops. If you start medications and stop medications, resistance develops.
In Voronin's hospital is a ward full of HIV babies. Their mothers took drugs, got AIDS, and have now abandoned their babies. The critical shortage of money since the collapse of the Russian economy has left Voronin with an awesome dilemma. Not only can he not give new patients the new therapy, but he also has to decide who among his old patients should no longer be treated. In effect, who will live and who will die.
I feel myself very bad. It's very difficult to find the words how I feel myself. I know all about their fates, about their lives. I feel myself like the murderer. We selected all these patients very carefully. We gave them the hope, but now we gave them the death sentence.
What the poor needed from the rich world was not expensive treatment for AIDS, but a vaccine. But prevention had always been the poor relation in the research laboratories of the West. In 1996, President Clinton tried to change that, challenging the scientific community to deliver a vaccine within a decade.
So let us today set a new national goal for science in the age of biology. Today let us commit ourselves to developing an AIDS vaccine within the next decade.
In this building is a small vaccine company called VaxGen. Its managing director is one of the early heroes of the fight against AIDS. He's always been skeptical about the willingness of pharmaceutical companies to develop a vaccine.
It's a remarkably small number who are really committed to prevention. Prevention's not very sexy. Treatment is very sexy. It's very fulfilling to the individual. Prevention, on the other hand, you have to have this long vision that I think our societies lack by and large. That you have to feel really good about doing something that didn't happen.
Francis raised the money personally to produce a vaccine himself. He has collected 5,000 American volunteers and 2,000 from Thailand, mainly men from high-risk groups.
Then you educate them totally on the risks and the benefits of the study, and most of its risk is the benefits we don't know at this point, that they're going to receive placebo, so please do not rely on the vaccine to protect yourself, and take precautions.
Francis's vaccine is being purified in these vats. They belong to the drug company Genentech, who pulled out a full partnership on commercial grounds. The most effective vaccine would involve the injection of a live virus into a healthy person, but that was too dangerous to risk in America. So Francis's team have developed a totally artificial vaccine. More safe, certainly, but some say it's too mild to be effective. It has worked on chimps, but it will take until at least 2001 to find out if it works on humans.
Do I think it's the vaccine and is going to work in 100% of individuals? I think that would be very optimistic, but I think it will work. The question is, will it work in a few percent for a few days or for a high percent for many years? And I am going to let the data speak for that and not have an opinion until we have the data.
Africa is the place which needs a vaccine the most. It was to Uganda that the French went to find a sufficient number of healthy people seriously at risk. The French, like Don Francis, planned to use a largely manufactured vaccine with minimal risk. But the government needed reassurance that their citizens weren't about to be exploited for the benefit of the West.
The fact that this was something new, not only in Uganda but in the world, therefore, were we being used as guinea pigs? Or were we equal and full scientific participants in this project?
The normal protocol is that vaccines should only be tested in developed countries where the healthcare system can cope with any adverse side effects. But with nearly 1 million Ugandans infected with HIV, the health authorities reckoned the risks presented by the clinical trials were easily outweighed by the potential benefits.
Many people thought that we were going to give people a vaccine and then expose them to HIV. But the way it is going to work is quite different. We are going to give people a vaccine, and then we are going to take blood from these individuals, and in the lab, in the test tube, that's where the experiment is going to take place.
The doctors will mix the vaccinated blood with HIV to see if it kills the virus. Initially, 40 healthy volunteers will be selected to test the safety of the vaccine. Half will receive a placebo, while the rest will receive enough vaccine to stimulate the body's defenses. Then the vaccine will be tested on several thousand people. The results will not be known for at least 5 years.
Where the ice has been broken, the vaccines and its principle has been accepted in this country.
But the decisive solution may emerge from a chance discovery in neighboring Kenya. Mujanga is a rural community where Uwala Rulia was a prostitute for over 20 years. This one room served as her home. There were 2 beds, one for sleeping, the other for business. She had an average of 30 sexual encounters every week in a community rife with HIV and AIDS.
Statistically, it is impossible not to be exposed to HIV in this kind of environment after prostituting for 20 years, not even 20, about 2 years. I think you should be exposed.
What makes Uwala remarkable is that despite her exposure to HIV, she has always tested negative, and she isn't alone. At the Mujanga clinic, where 1,700 patients were prostitutes, the infection rate was 90%, but 25 of the women remained consistently uninfected.
Some of these women in Nairobi who have stayed uninfected for many years, they have very many indifferent reasons for thinking why it's happened to them. I've heard one woman say it was God's blessing to compensate her for being poor and having to do this kind of work.
Back in 1994, the puzzle had been referred to Professor Andrew McMichael's team in Oxford. The women's blood was examined by Sarah Rowland Jones, who was convinced that their apparent immunity might reveal a route towards a safe vaccine for everyone. The first discovery was that although free from HIV, these women had extraordinarily high levels of T cells, the cells people produce when fighting HIV.
They were antibody negative, so the conventional HIV test was negative. And they were virus negative, so you couldn't find the virus in them however hard you tried. And yet they also had these killer cells reactive against HIV, immune cells which seek out and recognize HIV-infected cells and then kills them. And you usually only have that kind of immune response if you've been exposed to or indeed infected with HIV. So it looks like it's these cells that have been responsible for either clearing or at least protecting them from HIV. And that has been a major influence on our thinking that a vaccine is first of all possible and that a vaccine should stimulate the same kind of immune response we see in these people.
Then a separate discovery in America revealed a new line of defense even before the T cells came into play.
Hi, Sal.
Steve Crone had watched his lover die of AIDS. He expected to follow him soon.
You'd see something on your skin, or, oh, that's it, you know, that's it, or I'm going to get AIDS and die, or you get sick for some unknown reason. You felt like, well, this could be it.
But it wasn't. Each time he gave blood, he braced himself to hear the results were positive. But every time, they were negative.
Why me? You know, why isn't anybody, is there something to be looked at here? That was the underlying question. And I tried to explore that, and I got really very little results.
But Steve persevered. Eventually, he heard that researchers in New York were trying to locate gay men in the general population with the same immunity that had been found in the Kenyan prostitutes. One of the researchers was a Scotsman called Bill Paxton.
I took Steve's blood and we took it into the lab and basically isolated the cells into different fractions. and we took the fraction where the virus replicates. And when I took that and threw onto HIV, what we noticed was no replication. What I saw was no replication of HIV whatsoever on his cells. They're in culture for 2 weeks. It's a 2-week culture, and at the end of those 2 weeks we had nothing. We had no viral HIV infection whatsoever.
It's kind of strange. It's like suddenly you're in a war zone, you know, and suddenly, well, you know, you're going to be able to walk through this war zone and nothing, bombs are going to go off around you and you're not going to get hit. So it's curious. Give me about a half a pound, please.
Steve's immunity was different from the prostitute's. It wasn't extra T cells. There was a small defect in his normal cells that appeared to prevent the HIV virus from getting inside to infect them. Bill Paxton continued to search for other cases to confirm his findings.
No, at this stage I was more skeptical because we only had one patient. The real excitement came when we got another patient with a similar profile. That's when the excitement was, because here we had 2 patients with the same story. We take their lymphocytes, we try to infect them, nothing.
So I must have been good.
The news came to the attention of Robert Gallo, a brilliant but controversial scientist who had been caught up 10 years earlier in a row over the credit for discovering HIV. Gallo was already exploring ways of harnessing some of the body's natural proteins, called chemokines, as defenses to fight HIV. His team examined Paxton's results. Initially, they weren't impressed.
I tended not to get me too excited. I also thought they could have been lucky that the person that they're in contact with have very low-level virus at the time. But then the story started to build too much. And then you start saying, oh my God, there's something to this thing. Is there something else that we don't know about that is free in the plasma, in the circulation, like an antibody, but something quite different? So,
After 5 months, Gallo's team thought they had the answer. They discovered that Steve's strangely defective cells made his body produce an excessive number of chemokines. So many that they blocked the virus's way into the healthy cells. This seemed to confirm Gallo's view that extra chemokines were a protection against the virus. Other teams took the view that the abnormality itself in Steve's cells was more important. Either way, it was a huge fillip to research, though unlikely to yield concrete results till the next century.
I think we cannot predict when a vaccine will come. I think it's a little bit foolish to try to do so. Like 5 years, 10 years, 8 years, 6 years, we get in trouble when we do that. And there's always surprises. So it's even theoretically possible that it could be never. I don't believe that, or I wouldn't be working on it. I think a vaccine is doable. But I think we have to be honest and admit that we're not 100% sure it is doable.
To some doctors, none of that meets the needs of the moment. To cut corners, Dr. Mike Yule, director of HIV research at a London hospital, has volunteered as a guinea pig for a more perilous route to a vaccine. Yule, who is himself gay, has agreed to inject himself with what's called live attenuated vaccine. More dangerous than the manufactured vaccines, but potentially more effective.
I'm all right.
There's been intense worry in the scientific and academic community about the risks of having an HIV live attenuated vaccine. I think a few people do have to risk their health for the good of society. The risk, I think, is mainly related around the worry that people who are infected with a live attenuated vaccine for HIV would then go on to develop disease, that the virus would multiply within the body and would actually revert to a